Hello. Now we're going to bind off this project. I've gotten to the top. I've got a piece of fabric here that is, let's see how big it is. It's a little over 7 inches in length and got 40 stitches across on a size 8 needle. So maybe it's about 6 inches wide. About 6 inches wide. Yeah, a little more than 6. Okay, so I'm going to bind off. And this may be a reminder for some people, or maybe it's the first time you've ever laid eyes on binding off. But how we do it is we're going to bind off in pattern. You don't have to. You could bind off by knitting every stitch, but it happens that we were knitting and purling, so I'll show you how to bind off in pattern in this case. Okay, so on some projects you would bind off by just knitting every stitch, but we're going to alternate with knitting and purling as we bind off. For binding off, you work your first 2 stitches, so I did a knit and then a purl, and then of these 2 stitches we're going to take stitch 1 and using the knitting needle we're going to jump stitch 1 over stitch 2 and off the needle. So that's 1 stitch finished. Okay, then move the yarn to the back and make a knit stitch, and when you have 2 on your needle, the older one of the 2 jumps over and off the needle. The biggest mistake I see people do when they're binding off is to strangle the stitch. There's no need to strangle it. It will tighten by itself while you make the next stitch, so you can just skip that step altogether. Very rarely do I see a person who's binding off too loosely, so you just let that tightening happen by itself naturally. So now I have 2 stitches, so the older one of the 2 has to jump over the newer one and off the needle, and now we have a knit stitch, and we just carry on down the row. They each one leapfrogs over the other after you make a new stitch. So when I have only 1 on the right hand side, I'm gonna work 1 more stitch, and now I have 2, and the older stitch jumps over the new one. And I just try and resist that urge to tighten the stitch. It really is a common problem, is that tightening of the stitches, and you can just quit that step altogether if you like. If your knitting is too loose, we can work on that easily. But if it's too tight, it makes everything very hard. Okay, so each one jumps over the next. My yarn has to go to the back for a knit stitch and jump over. Now I can demonstrate this continental style as well. That's where we hold the yarn in the left hand. It's just a little bit faster. So I'm purling and jumping the older stitch over and knitting and jumping the older stitch over and purling and jump over. We go all the way down the row doing that without tightening. Okay, so that's a little bit about binding off. When I get to the very last stitch at the end of the row, I'm going to have just one stitch left when I get to the tail end, and I'll cut my yarn maybe about at least a foot long, so I have plenty to sew up the sides of my glove with. Okay, so I'll catch you back in a few minutes when I'm ready to do the sewing up, and I'll show you how that's done too. Okay, see you later. Bye.